Oh,
Hello.
Hi there.
hey. Hi, Steve. Hi, Tracy.
Hi there.
How are you all?
We're good.
Good. How you doing?
Great. No, I'm real good. I've done a 2-hour tutorial presentation just before this, so my voice is a bit sore, but I think I'll make it.
2 hours is a long time.
It's a long time for a monologue.
Exactly.
Yes, it is a very long time for a monologue.
And it wasn't, there was no like discussion or anything. It's just,
Those are always the hardest.
Especially if
Yeah.
it's PowerPoint and the PowerPoints are bullet pointed.
Yeah, it was there wasn't any opportunity for anyone else to kind of grab the mic, and so
Well, did you learn anything?
Oh, he presented.
I presented, but yeah, I
Really?
did.
Did you learn anything?
I learned some about about holding 2-hour monologues,
Yes.
and that I should probably not.
I think when you present, you learn more than you do when you are in the audience.
Yeah, that's a good point. At least it seemed like many stayed till the end, so
Oh, that's a good thing.
yeah, it's at least something. It's a good sign.
I'm working on updating our documentation and creating some Ortelius training. Have you used anything that's online for online training?
For online training.
Yeah. Steve, you said you looked at something from O'Reilly. You said, what was it called?
Kata code. I think it was called.
Trying to figure out new ways to do even just webcasts in general. You know, at Ortelius, we had a blast doing it, but we incorporated Twitch into an event that we did. We had like 5 presentations, and it mixed it up some. You know, it just wasn't quite so dry, I guess you could say. You know, because we're an alien, we did like snippets from Flash Gordon from the 1950s, which if you haven't watched them, you will crack up. It's thoroughly entertaining. You almost can see the wires hanging from the spaceships flying around. And it helped, but I'm thinking that there's got to be ways to do those kinds of presentations that mix up different, you know, different solutions, like
Yeah, for sure.
some online training that's presented through Twitch or something. It's like we're ready for the next evolution in PowerPoint.
Excuse me. Good morning, all, or good afternoon and evening, depending on where you are all. I used this. It's not very fancy. The company, it's not terribly. The presentation of what they do is not very fancy, but the material that they present and the way they present it is pretty effective, actually. So it's worth a look.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining the meeting. Sorry for interrupting your chat. It was fun to listen. So I hope you can see my screen right now. I hope I am sharing the HackMD document. If not, then I need to fix that. So we gave a break for our meetings. We skipped the previous meeting, so because there wasn't any topic and there wasn't any progress with some of the topics we have been working on. So this is kind of a bit of recap meeting. So the agenda is here on the meeting minutes document. We will start with action item review as usual, and then we will give heads up about the interoperability during CDCon. So please add that to your schedule and join to the discussion. And then just a quick reminder about Spdx file information topic, which we said we will have a conversation about it using GitHub discussions. And then I see Anders joined us. Thanks a lot for joining, Anders. And we will have a presentation from you on Open Policy Agent. So we will use the rest of the meeting for your presentation and any follow-up conversations. And if anyone has any topic you want to add, please do that. So we touch that topic as well before we hand over to Anders. So the action items. During the previous meeting a month ago, we said we will start with this file information for Spdx specification. And 2 action items are there. The first action item is not done because I was able to create the discussion topic this morning. But the second action item is enabling GitHub discussions for the repository, which I did, so we can close that action item. And the other action item was on Kara, and we have Anders here, so we can close action item on Kara to reach out to the Policy Agent community. Thanks, Kara, for that. And those were the action items. So now the next topic is the Birds of Feather session. So as you know, like the last CDCon, CDCon is having Birds of Feather sessions. Let me go to full schedule. And if you click the Birds of Feather sessions or filter using both sessions, you will see we have 9 Birds of Feather sessions. And if I am counting it right, 3 of them are for special interest groups. The first one is events special interest group, which will happen on Wednesday, June 23rd. So please join to that one if you want to take part in the conversation and contribute to the events SIG, or just hear what they're up to, because I see lots of activity in Slack channel on GitHub repository. Looks like they're having lots of fun there. So join to that one. And then the MLOps SIG will happen at the same time as SIG events, which is kind of a bit unfortunate. I don't know if any of you want to highlight this to event organizers to change the time of SIG both, so people can participate in both SIGs if they are in different days times. And then the SIG Interoperability Birds of Feather session will happen on Thursday, June 24th. And the rest of the SIGs are for projects starting with Jenkins X, and then Ortelius has its own Birds of Feather at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And Tecton has its own Birds of Feather. So just please check the schedule. And if you have any concerns with the scheduling, reach out to Jacqueline or others to see if they can do anything with the schedule. Otherwise, we have to live with this schedule if they can't. We put that link here for easy access.
So Fatih, was there,
Yeah.
do you think that there's a concern with that schedule, or was there an overlap that I wasn't recognizing?
Yeah,
well, I
it's
guess
like
that,
yeah, I think both sessions, like, I'm not saying like the talks or presentations are not important, but both sessions are generally interactive, and like you may watch session recordings afterwards, but missing Birds of a Feather session means that you miss the discussion live. So
right.
that is why I am kind of a bit concerned.
Did you bring it up? Have you brought it up
No.
to anybody?
No, not yet. This is the first time I'm talking about this.
I wonder what they, because it looks like they just decided to put all the BOFs in a like a 2-hour time frame.
Yeah. Maybe let me action myself. I will reach out to Jackie and Tracy and see if they can do anything. Because like project sessions are in parallel as well. Because events project is talking about Jenkins X collaboration, for example. So Jenkins X community will miss taking part in events, Birds of a Feather and vice versa.
Yeah.
And Ortelius conflicts with other sessions. But yeah, let me action that and see if they have any way to somehow make this better.
Yeah, I think that that Jenkins having the events in Jenkins X at the same time is probably the biggest problem.
Yeah.
I am guessing the person to talk to.
Is it Jennifer or?
I think Jennifer Crowley would be the first person to reach out to. I don't know who created the schedule.
Yeah, I will.
There's
her
her email. I just put it in the chat.
Yeah.
You might CC her or reach out there.
Yeah, I can send to Jackie, Jennifer, and Tracy to see who can help with this. Because like, yeah, it could have been better if we noticed this earlier, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, then we have interoperability and Tecton on the same time too, I see. Yeah.
And as I said, like, yeah, all the sessions are valuable, but for the regular sessions, you can watch recordings afterwards, but the missing discussions is actually kind of why it made this a bit kind of.
I'll mention it. I'm on the, there's a strategy call today for the board. I'll mention it on the board too. But if you could go ahead and reach out to those, to Jennifer and Tracy and Jackie, and I'll see.
I will CC you as well. And if like you get some feedback from board or strategy discussion, then you can respond to that as well.
I'll just mention it at the strategy meeting that there may be some problems with that schedule.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Kara, for asking to talk about Birds of a Feather sessions. Otherwise, like, we could have missed this. I don't know if anyone else brought this up, but yeah, it seems like not. So the next topic is Spdx file information. So this, let me find the original document. So as you may remember, we gave a try to start conversation around the standardized metadata on HackMD document. And then I think it was James Strachan who suggested to create a separate repo to continue with that work. And that didn't get much attention. And then after we met with Spdx community, or after Kate Stewart from Spdx community joined our meeting and presented what they are doing within Spdx community, the consensus within this group was to, instead of us starting everything from scratch, we should perhaps look at what they have done and what are the overlaps, what are the gaps, and perhaps contribute to Spdx from CI/CD perspective. And Kate was also in agreement that they may benefit from expertise from CDF community as part of their, work on similar topic. And then we decided to use the discussions to, continue this work. And 2 hours ago, I created the issue or the discussion topic. And I realized this was very late to do, but I tagged a few of you there, Steve, James, Kate, and Tracy, Miranda. So please, if you have any, ideas about the file information, anything you feel missing in the spec when it comes to CI/CD, or anything you see, oh, this is perfect, it covers our needs, then we can collect those things here and then talk to Kate, or Kate hopefully sees that conversation here and comes and shares her feedback with us. And I stop talking. Maybe Steve, anything you want to add?
No, that sounds like a good plan. And I think whatever we find that's not in the spec, I think the Spdx group is interested in our feedback. So especially since they're coming at it from a different angle than we are. So it'll be useful information for us to gather for this process.
Yeah. I also want to, Andrea, Emil, maybe Tracy, I've seen references to Spdx in events discussions as well. And I noticed this vocabulary work is happening and some kind of, CDF events work start that are based on cloud events. I know if you have plans to, somehow look at what Spdx done and perhaps provide feedback from events SIG.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Please go on.
I mean, I've looked at both of them, and it didn't even dawn on me to try to cross-pollinate between those two.
Yeah, but
I
we
guess
have discussed, yeah, and there is a discussion point, I believe, in GitHub on it, but no one has taken on the responsibility to look into it deeper. But we see that there are reasons to look into it, of course.
But then what I can suggest is like this discussion always start here. Maybe once you see some further discussions under this, topic, maybe when you see, oh, this is pretty related to what we are doing, and then you can bring that into your events SIG when you have, time to look at that, because I see you are very focused on the proof of concept work and vocabulary work at the moment, and you may not have time to look Spdx as well.
it will be something that the Ortelius team will keep focused on. I'll promise you that we've got some stuff we have to get done and get through. But on the roadmap is aggregating this information up to a logical application. So we're thinking about how this data needs to be displayed and shared, and when it should be gathered. So we'll circle around and get back to it. It's something we have started, but we've got to finish some service catalog data first. I don't want to throw it to the team just yet, but they've already started thinking through it. I mean, Steve, you want to enhance on that discussion?
Well, right now we're specifically focused on container images and addressing that first versus file data, because of the microservice viewpoint that we're taking. So when we look at gathering information right now, we're trying to gather information about the image, but also what's in the image, where we are looking at CVEs and licenses at this point, and where the Spdx is coming into play. But eventually we'll get into tracking at the file level of what is in a container. And then if you're talking about like a regular, we're going to do a war file deployment, that would be more of the typical monolithic style, where we would be tracking the information around a file. And that would be more specific to the Spdx spec around the file. So it's on our container perspective first.
Okay, then yeah, I look forward to anything that could be contributed by Ortelius team as well when they have time. Okay, so Steve, I will probably ping you on Slack as well. I need to collect my notes, and then if anyone else wants to take part in this, obviously please start following the discussion, and even better, go in there and just add your thoughts on this, and we can get this going while we have while Kate still remembers us. Otherwise, it may take time to get back to the discussion if we give too much break. So that was the Spdx file information. And a new topic, note about the CNCF operations doc. I don't see who added that topic, so please. Who wants to talk about this?
Oh, are you talking about, oh, that was me, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Here is the CNCF application delivery SIG has been working on a generic operator white paper. It is pretty thorough. I read through it yesterday. It's actually, I think they did a great job of building it out. And it's really just talking about operators in general, not in the terms of a GitOps operator, but how operators in general should look. I just bring it up because it could be something that we want to reference. It is almost an integration, you know, how you can use an operator to do anything you choose to do. But it has some interoperability overtones, and it may be something that the events SIG might want to look at as well around a listener. So if you get a chance to, they are looking for, they're asking for comments right now because they want to finalize it and make it public, or, you know, get some publishing around it. So it's out there and it's in the chat. Let me actually put it in the I'll put it in the doc.
Oh, I actually did that.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I've seen this doc as well. I've forgotten about it. Thanks for highlighting that. Actually, since you mentioned Tracy, App Delivery is doing lots of like interesting stuff. I don't know if anyone has seen this potato head or something like it.
Yeah, I've looked at that. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
How do I describe it? It's really how to put your manage infrastructure components.
And the thing that got my attention is like they talk about like multiple different like CD technologies like Flux, Argo CD, Captain, and so on. It's like, it looks like fun to play with, and it also, you know, perhaps we can, you know, talk to them again. I think we had some participation from Captain folks or others from App Delivery in our SIG, but I don't see them here today during today's meeting. But this repo or what they do there looks interesting as well.
Yep.
Let me link it as well. Okay. Thanks, Tracy. Before we move to Anders, anyone wants to bring up a quick, short topic? Okay, Anders, now I stop sharing and then the stage is yours.
All right, I'll share. Okay, see here. Okay, so there we go. Okay, first of all, I'm glad to be here. Happy. Can you see my screen now? Is it full screen?
We can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, I'm Anders, and I work as a developer advocate for Styra, which is the inventors of open policy agents. And so that would be the topic for my talk here. And yeah, policy-based access control was the topic, but I've tried to kind of modify this a bit to fit into more of the CI/CD context, which I heard you are into. So the challenge here, what's the problem we're trying to solve with open policy agents is really to manage policy in increasingly distributed, complex, and heterogeneous systems. So the cloud native landscape just one thing that we can probably all agree on, it's complex. There are a lot of technologies for applications. There are a lot of container technologies and deployment platforms. There are all these cloud vendors, and there's all these different data sources. And they all have their own way of dealing with policy. And when I say policy, it most often pertains to authorization, like who can do what in the system. But it could also be other forms of organizational policies, like what type of resources can we deploy to this or that cluster and under what conditions. So the goal of Oppa is really to unify policy enforcement across the whole cloud native stack. And even if we say the cloud native stack, Oppa obviously works very well for older type of systems as well. So this is really what Oppa tries to do. It tries to have one unified way of dealing with policy in all these kind of disparate systems. So what is Oppa then? It's an open source general purpose policy engine. And it kind of has to be general purpose in order to work with all these different systems. It offers a unified toolset and framework for working with policy across the stack. A keyword here is decoupling. Oppa decouples policy from application logic. So what it means is pretty much how you would decouple storage from your application logic and move that into a database. In the same way, Oppa decouples policy and so you move that out from your application and into Oppa. So ideally, your application won't even know that there's an admin user or that there's certain roles or permissions, but that part is delegated over to Oppa. Oppa is a decision engine. So Oppa makes policy or decisions based on policy, but it doesn't itself enforce anything. So Oppa is just going to tell you this is a good or bad idea, but it's not going to act on that. So that's still up to the application to do. And that is, of course, highly context specific, whether it's to serve, I don't know, a 403 response code, or whether it is to send a message to some Slack chat, or maybe inform the authorities. That's highly context specific, and hence why Oppa does not do enforcement. That would be very hard to do in all these different tech stacks. So in order to be this kind of unifying force, policies are written in a declarative language called Rego, which is an integral part of Oppa. And some of the most common use cases for Oppa, it includes Kubernetes admission control, which I'll touch on a bit more later, microservice or app authorization, infrastructure policies, data source filtering, and CI/CD pipeline policies. I think these numbers are a bit old by now, but still, Oppa is a vibrant open source community. We have 160 contributors from, I think, 50 or so different companies, 50 integrations, around 5,000 GitHub stars, 4,000 Slack users, and so on. The numbers aren't that important, but it's a vibrant open source community. And the ecosystem includes not just Oppa, but also many sub-projects and external projects, such as ConfTest for configuration testing, which I think is we'll look into a bit later. It's very relevant in the CI/CD context. There's Gatekeeper for doing Kubernetes admission control. There's various editor integrations for VS Code and IntelliJ. But of course, it's not just a hobbyist open source project either, but Oppa is used in one way or other in many of the larger or the largest enterprises in the world. And if that wasn't enough to convince you, I think this quote from Kelsey Hightower kind of summarizes OPA perfectly. So the Open Policy Agent project is super dope. I finally have a framework that helps me translate written security policies into executable code for every layer of the stack. So that's spot on. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve. So how do we achieve that? And how can we work with all these technologies that, of course, those technologies were written entirely without OPA in mind. So how does OPA fit in? And the secret here is basically the policy decision model, where we have a service. And when I say service, this could really be anything. It's anything who accepts requests. And that could, of course, be a microservice, an HTTP API, a database, Kafka, or what have you. Anything that services requests. And of course, most software components does that in some form. So when a request is received in our service, what it then does, it reaches out to OPA. And that's also another request. It's just HTTP. OPA is normally run as a server. So that service reaches out to OPA and it asks, based on the policy you have and the data you have, and as part of the query, you can also include more data. Maybe you have some information on where is this request heading, like for what path, and who is the user making this request. So based on the policy you have, based on the data that you have, and maybe some data that I provide, should this request be allowed or denied? That would be a very common scenario. And the input you provide to OPA is just JSON. And the output, like the decision OPA returns, is also just JSON. So any service that's capable of speaking HTTP and JSON can thus integrate well with OPA. So that's kind of how we can work with so many different vendors, technologies, and so. As for deployment, OPA is a self-contained binary, so it's a single file. You don't need to, there's no dependencies and so on. And ideally, you deploy your OPA so as close to the service as possible. So this would normally mean you run OPA on the same host as your application, or as a daemon on the same machine. Kubernetes has this concept of sidecar containers, where you'd run OPA as a container inside the same pod as your application. And the purpose of this is, of course, to minimize latency, because since each request entering your application is going to consult OPA, you'd want that to be as fast as possible. So having OPA run on the other end of the data center, or even in some other part of the world, that's not going to work for most applications. And again, the way most applications communicate with OPA is through the REST API. I'll show some alternative ways later. There's also a Go library available if your application is written in Go. OPA is also written in Go, so that makes it easy to integrate in that way. There's for Envoy and Istio based like service meshes, there's a ready-made kind of version of OPA to work with that scenario. And finally, you can also compile policies to WebAssembly, so you can run OPA in pretty much any context where WebAssembly runs. So Rego is a declarative high-level policy language, which is used by OPA. And with declarative, we just mean that sort of like SQL, rather than saying exactly how you want something done, you just say what you want done. An OPA policy, just like a real world policy, I guess, consists of a number of rules. That's pretty much what a policy, the definition of a policy. And a rule in Oppa can return true or false, a Boolean rule. That's very common for authorization. You just want to know, is this allowed or not? But it's not limited to that. Again, Oppa returns JSON. So any data type or value available in JSON is also available for Oppa. So you might as well return strings, lists, and objects. And a pretty common scenario is that when you deny something or deny someone, you also want to tell them why the request was denied, so that they can know and do something about it. Oppa includes 150 plus built-in functions, and it's not a general purpose programming language. So these functions are kind of adapted to the policy or for policies pretty much. So things like dealing with JSON web tokens, date and time, IP address ranges, and things that make sense from a policy perspective. And Oppa ships with a unit testing framework. So you can also, like after you have written your policies, you can also test them in isolation. So to kind of build confidence in that these policies do what you intend. It's a very well-documented project. I think I'm obviously a little biased, but I think it's one of the better documented open source projects. And for trying Oppa out without even downloading anything, there's the Rego Playground, which is an interactive playground where you can try policy, change or tweak some parameters in the input, and then evaluate the policy and see what happens. And that's I'll give you a demo on that in a few minutes. But before I do that, we've talked about policy, and again, I think I mentioned that there are the two things that Oppa takes into account when it makes its decisions. It's policy, but it is also data. So this data could either be provided as part of the request, as part of the query input, and we call that input data, but it could also be provided asynchronously to Oppa, either by pushing data into Oppa or have Oppa pulling data. I mean, we call those data bundles. Yeah, bundles pretty much. So Oppa can be configured to pull bundles of data from some remote endpoint. And this enables Oppa to also be centrally managed. So you can have kind of a control plane or so. And that's what Styra does pretty much. Finally, there's also an HTTP send, like an HTTP client that you can use from inside of your policies to reach out to other endpoints and fetch data at policy evaluation time. That's obviously not ideal. So if you can avoid that, you probably should, because again, we want to minimize latency. We want these decisions to be as fast as possible. But in some cases, we really need the data to be up to date, or we need to know now, like what's the status right now at some remote endpoint. So in that case, it's there for you. I think I managed the bundle API already, and these management APIs, they're really, this is not where you'd start your Oppa journey, but this is once you have 10, 20, maybe 50 or hundreds of Oppas, you're eventually going to need some form of management. And Oppa offers a number of management APIs for that purpose. So the bundle API I mentioned before, it's a way for Oppa to go out and retrieve policy and data from some remote endpoint. The decision log API is super important. I think it's Oppa's way to actually report back on the decisions it took. So any decision Oppa ever takes is logged. And I think that's also in larger organizations where you have this like super diverse environment. And I know at a previous employer I was at, we had 8 or 9 programming languages running in our microservice environment. And obviously everyone did logging their own way. So it was even though we know what to search for, it was really hard to find things like authorization decisions, if those were even logged. So Oppa unifies this as well. And there's status API, not as important, but just a way for Oppa to kind of report back that it's good and healthy. Discovery API for fetching config from remote endpoints as well. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to give you all a quick demo of Rego and how that works. So I'm going to exit the presentation mode and show you the Rego Playground and how that looks. So to our left here, we have an empty policy, and all policies belong to a package or like a sort of like a namespace or module in other languages. In this case, we just call it play. And to our right here, we have input, or kind of simulate input, since there's really no real request going on here. So in this case, I prepared some, and I just made an input where sort of what you could expect maybe from a microservice. So a microservice has an incoming request, and that request is a GET request. It's heading for the user's path, and inside of that request, there's also some user data. So what a policy then would look like in Rego, it looks something like this. We'd have a name of a policy. We call this the rule. So the name of the rule in this case is allow. Allow itself doesn't mean anything to Oppa. It's not a keyword or anything, but the name of the rules are totally arbitrary. And of course, this is also to enable this kind of general purpose. So allow might make sense in authorization context, but not in others. But in this case, we call the rule allow. And in this case, and the rule name is followed by a body. And it's kind of inverted to how you'd work with kind of if or conditional things in other programming languages. Since the rule, we say that the rule here is true if all the conditions in the body are true. So if we, for example, say input, now we reference something in the input, we say request, and we see method is equal to get. And if we evaluate this now, we'd see that the allow rule is true because this condition was true. So it's how you normally write this in, I don't know, JavaScript or something. It's probably something like this. If input is equal to get, and then after each line, each condition is ANDed together with the next line. So if you add more lines or more conditions, they all need to be true in order for the allow rule to be true. So we might want to have a rule that says that reading on the user endpoint, that seems harmless. So we say good. We have another condition here, request. We say path is equal to users. And we evaluate this, and we see that this is still true, of course. So if we change some condition here, we say put, I want to edit. We'll see if I evaluate this now, it's just undefined. And that's the default behavior of Rego. If something does not evaluate, it's just undefined. So if we want to change that, we could just say that by default, allow should be false. And we evaluate this now. And now we see, okay, instead of getting nothing back, we get at least to know that this was not allowed. And if I change this back, we'll see that once again, it should be working. Okay, so that's one.
A quick question. So how do you do an OR statement? It's just to say, I want to return true if the method is get or put.
Yeah, you're one step ahead of me. That was exactly where I was getting to. So the way you do that is you'd actually just add another allow rule. So now we say that this should be true. If somebody tries to read from the user's endpoint, we should allow that. We can also say that if the request method is put, and we just copy that because that should be the same. So, and we evaluate. So we change this to put, we evaluate, and we can see that this is true. And another pretty nice feature of the playground is you can say, you can enable coverage. So when you evaluate, you'll see which one of these rules evaluated to true. And in this case, of course, it's the put rule. So this would be a super simple example of how to offer policies in Rego. And of course, there's a lot more to it. All these built-in functions, there's many language constructs and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to kind of provide a basic idea of what a Rego policy looked like and how policy evaluation works. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll just I did some special slides here for you for this context, because in CI/CD deployments there are some things to consider, and of course you guys are the experts here, so you tell me if I'm wrong here. But one thing is that in this context, when you kind of have a build or a deployment, you might not want to have an HTTP server like Oppa running at all times, because many of these build tasks and so on, they just spin up something and then they do what they're meant to do, and then they kind of just then they shut down. And of course, you could still have Oppa running somewhere else and then query that. But there are, fortunately, other ways to evaluate policy. Oppa also has a command called Oppa Eval, which you can use to do like one-off evaluations of data and policy. So you say, here's my policy, here's some data. What would you decide? And then Oppa just provides a response to that and shuts down pretty much. I mentioned in passing before, one of the sub-projects of Oppa is named ConfTest. And they kind of take Oppa Eval to a next level, where you build a test suite and you run that policy-based tests on data files. So configuration files, deployment resources, or what have you. And so you normally run that as part of your CI/CD pipeline. And you say, like, if you check in new configuration files or you make changes to them, we're going to run these tests on all those files. And if you violate something in our policy, we're going to fail this build. And another nice thing with ConfTest is, so Oppa itself works with JSON and YAML, and the ConfTest kind of extends on that to work with many other formats, which I think is common in this context. So some specific CI/CD use cases, which, or at least the most common ones for Oppa. I don't say they're the most common ones for anything, but for Oppa, I think these are probably the most common ones. First, it's validation. Yeah, and then there's triggering, and then there's Kubernetes admission control. And I think by far the most common one is probably to do validation. And validation is just to either scan some resources, scan configuration, or make any form of policy decision based on whatever data is available. And of course, it could be time-based data, like you cannot do prod deploys on Black Friday, or you can't do it if no one is on call. It could also entail that for production deployments, there need to be a sign-off from somebody else. So that would be deployment policies. But of course, developers demand to know more increasingly, I'd say, like they want to know as early as possible if they did something wrong. So Oppa is can also run like Conftest. You can obviously run that on your local machine. You can install it as a pre-merge hook or pre-commit hook. And so you'd have like on each commit, you'd run and to make sure that you're not committing in something that violates policy. And for Terraform and other infrastructure as code solutions, Oppa is also available. And finally, we already mentioned Conftest and how that works. So you can write policies to make sure that even Docker files or NPM files and so on follow certain guidelines and policy. Triggering, that's a more advanced use case where you actually create workflows, or you have Oppa itself create workflows, workflow specs. Remember when I told you that Oppa decisions are JSON or YAML. So when you think of it, like workflow specs are also JSON and YAML in 95% of all cases. That's kind of how we work with declarative build and deployment pipelines. So given that you load context into Oppa, and this context could be taken from AWS, your cloud provider, GitHub data from your deployment environments, and then you could ask Oppa queries and have not Oppa just return yes or no, but actually return an entire like workflow spec. So you could have policies to analyze the context and then decide what jobs need to be run, which images to build, which tests to execute, which images to be garbage collected, and so on. So that's another, and I think very interesting use case for Oppa, but obviously not as common. Finally, there's the Kubernetes admission controller, and this isn't specific to CI/CD, but given how many of these CI/CD systems that run inside of Kubernetes and kind of are Kubernetes native, I think it's still an interesting angle to cover. So the Kubernetes admission controllers, what they do is really they allow policy to validate and deny resources as they are created in Kubernetes or updated. So if you say, I want to deploy this application, and you say kubectl apply, and then you provide some resources, then you can provide a policy that says, unless there's a label for marking which team deployed this, it's not going to go. We're going to deny that. There needs to be a cost center label, or there needs to be some annotation, or each application must have at least one replica or two replicas, or else we don't consider that safe. So things like that. That's what we call policy guardrails, where we can have some assurance in knowing that not, even if we can give kind of the keys to our developers so they can deploy at their own will, it doesn't mean that anything goes. There's also the mutating admission controller, which is not as commonly used, but it's also a pretty interesting feature of the Kubernetes API, where you don't just say this goes or doesn't, but you actually mutate a resource on its way to be created or updated. And there are some good use cases for it, but it's also rather, I'd say it's a little risky, because essentially the developer or whoever deploys a resource, they have no way of knowing that you actually mutated the resource on its way in. So what they see in their configuration file or in their deployment spec might not then correspond to what was actually deployed. So yeah, it's a bit of a there are useful applications for this, but I think be careful with that. So from a CI/CD context, if we talk about like Tecton and these, they also work with these Kubernetes custom resource definitions. So if you want to deploy a task, for example, that's also just a Kubernetes resource. So they are also going to pass through admission control. So you can say that, sure, you can deploy tasks or pipelines or whatever, but they're all going to pass our admission controller and our policies. So you can only deploy tasks of this type, or they can't be too complex, or whatever policy makes sense for you. Yeah, just this was just a quick illustration of how kind of Oppa kind of jacks into these modules as a resource is on its way to be persisted in etcd, which is the database kind of behind Kubernetes. So first, the request is authenticated. We find out who is trying to do this, and if that's allowed, or if that works, we pass that on to authorization. And if the request is authorized, then we hit these admission controllers. So first is the mutating admission controller, and followed by the validating admission controller. So at each of these steps, except for authentication, you can have Oppa consulted for policy decisions. Okay, so that was pretty much it on Oppa Rego. A quick introduction. I think I have a few minutes left, so I normally include this for developers who are curious about like where okay, so this sounds good, like where do we start? And I normally suggest that just start small, even if Oppa can even if it's general purpose and you can use it like in all these spaces. I just start small. Use the Oppa docs. Again, they're a great resource. And then maybe start considering, like, in the applications you work with normally, or in the build and deployment pipelines, there's bound to be policies there already. They might not just be explicit, but they're often kind of tangled into code or in other contexts. So don't really try and identify which policies you have already, rather than just try and write new policy. And once you have identified a couple of policies, then you can start to delegate some of those responsibilities to Oppa. And again, you don't need to rewrite your whole application or your CI/CD pipeline, but you could start with something small, maybe a single endpoint, maybe a role or something like that. Deploy that, and you build experience from there. And once you start to scale up, you can look into these management features I mentioned, like logging, bundle servers, and so on. There's the Styra Academy, which is an excellent resource of tutorials, or video tutorials, and quiz-style tests. Also, since I'm from Styra, I mentioned the Styra DAS. It's the Declarative Authorizations Service, which is our commercial control plane. And a good place to start, if you'd like to know more or like to continue the discussion, is the Oppa Slack. And with that, I say thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Nice job.
So I have one quick question. If I wanted to put a policy check into my Jenkins pipeline, where do I get started? You know, what do I need to install? And you know, I understand, you know, from your example, what I need to write from the policy example, but what do I actually have to like install and get going to be able to do that policy check?
Right. So either you choose to run Oppa inside of your like build or deployment agent, and then you could query Oppa with like Oppa Eval or something locally, or you could have Oppa running at some central location, and then you just use curl or whatever you'd want to query Oppa for a policy decision.
Okay, got it.
I have a question about for example, you have Canary deployment, and then you are collecting metrics via Prometheus. Can you enforce policies based on what you scrap from Prometheus, for example?
Oh yeah, sure. So anything that's data that can be represented as JSON or YAML, that's a fair target to use. And we have seen policies like people who integrate with things like Google Calendar API to see if somebody is on call, or if there are some notable events that should be taken into account. So pretty much any API is a good data source if it's irrelevant.
Okay. Any other question we have, perhaps?
One
Very
last question. Where are the policies, the Rego stored? Are those go in a Git repository, or do you load them into the database? And like, how are they versioned?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think normally, yeah, they are Git versions. So one of the big benefits of clearly working with policy as code is that it's not just code, but you can also adopt all these good best practices that you have when you're working with any other type of code. So your policies are version controlled. You work with pull requests and code review, linters, testers, and so on. So yeah, normally you'd store policies in Git, and then when you deploy or like policy deployment, then you package that into one of these bundles or so, which is then read by Oppa.
Got it. All right.
Okay, Anders, may I ask you to upload your presentation to the repo, CD Foundation presentations repo, so people can have it. I put the link to chat, because you have this CI/CD parts which may not be available in your other presentations, perhaps, so it would be good to have these slides there.
Of course, I'll upload it.
Okay, thanks a lot for great presentation, Anders, and thank you, Kara, for getting us in touch.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you, Anders. It was excellent.
Thanks all for having me. I enjoyed being here. Okay, bye then.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
our next meeting is on 17th of June, and please join to that one as well if you are interested in taking part in conversations. And have a nice day, everyone, and talk to you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, bye.